I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and the elders from other communities who may be here today with us on Gadigal land. Thank you for the opportunity. And I also, in fact, want to acknowledge the CEW members, because in fact all women stand on the shoulders of the women who've gone before us as well. And I think the CEW women who began this organisation are the women upon whose shoulders all of us stand. So I acknowledge you as well. Tonight is a celebration of women, and we have a lot to celebrate. But we also need to ensure we're not complacent about the challenges that are still ahead. I've been asked to talk about my journey, one that ranges from radiography in Queensland to public servant, to banking to cruise boss. But what binds and defines that for me is change. So let's talk about change. The change that's happening in the world around us and the change that we have the power to affect. Change can often start with something small. For me, it's when you have an idea, just a first thought or an instinct. The reaction from others is usually, what would we want to do that for? It's too hard. I don't care. Is it worth the risk? Such responses make you feel like you're embarking upon another Mount Everest. But experience tells me to gird your loins, stick to your values, and have the courage to see things differently. Change always begins with a simple question. What can I do about this? Even at school in Brisbane, I saw the world differently. I wanted to change the things I thought were unfair or just stupid. Why was my choice for subjects needlework and not metalwork? Home science, as it was called, which was code for cooking for your husband. I did like cooking, but I was much more interested in understanding and learning about physics and maths. This divide didn't stop at school. When I graduated, the job ads in the local Courier Mail were listed under the heading Men and Boys and Women and Girls. It was clear at the very start of my career that my prospects could be defined by gender, and hence my opportunities could be bound by gender. My conclusion? There was something wrong in our world. And I've sought to climb over those barriers ever since and break down the barriers for others along the way. My passion for change is in my DNA, and it's also driven my career leaps from one sector to another. When I joined Carnival Australia in 2007, we were at the tail end of a coronial inquest into the death of Diane Brimble on one of our ships 5 years earlier. Our reputation was in tatters. Australia was the worst performing market in Carnival globally, an afterthought really, and an irritation. Some proposed that the best course was to rebrand to save the business, which of course meant burying our heritage. But we chose to rebuild from the bottom of the ship up. To transform, we had to rethink the business, our product, our market, our customer segments, our crew mix, but also importantly, to rethink our relationship with the Pacific and the countries and communities that we visit. We had to bring the communities along with us on our journey. Our refreshed business strategy was focused on two things. First, we wanted people in the Pacific to want us to come. And second, the places we go should be better as a result of us visiting. Essentially, we set out to create shared value. We all know that companies only do well when the communities in which they operate do well. When you operate in a way that shares value with customers and have a culture that lets people thrive, all people. Many imagine that a large cruise ship arriving in a small island in the South Pacific will bring abundance and joy. That's often true, but it's not necessarily the case. The impact can be very large, both good and sometimes bad. In Vanuatu, when I started, we had the local community refuse us entry as their fishing yield had dropped, and they blamed the ship, although that wasn't the problem, but hey. We didn't have a relationship in the place to discuss the issue. In fact, we had a very limited relationship, meaning there was no starting point for a conversation. To drive the change we needed to expand, we had to create a different path of engaging, which was listening and understanding people who had a very, very different perspective on the world. I've always found it interesting that companies that end up coming unstuck are those who are at odds with contemporary social mores in the values that drive their business practices, and often in the treatment of their employees. Simon Longstaff, ethicist that we all know, says where there's a breakdown in ethics, there's a breakdown in trust, and people essentially dissociate themselves from what's happening. Many people associate ethics these days with codes and compliance, and they're scared. But ethics is really about answering the simple question, what should I do? It's about everyday decision making, and you realise that every decision we make shapes it in some way. It's the same for organisations and their leaders. Every decision we make, big and small, shapes our business. It reflects who we are and sends messages to our staff and to our customers. It's always easier for individuals to confront difficult ethical questions when the culture of their organisations has strong values to guide them. It gives them framework. Inclusion, for instance, has to be a core value in an organisation, because you know being inclusive means offering people the same opportunities regardless of gender or culture, sexual orientation or disability. Over the years, I've valued inclusiveness in my businesses, from banking to cruise, and it's had significant results. When Bob Joss took over as CEO at Westpac in the early 1990s, he famously looked out to a staff gathering and said, "Where are all the women?" He then required all of his executive team to recruit at least one woman to their team. I think we call that quota. That was my entry into Westpac, hired from running the Office of Status of Women in Canberra to Human Resources Head. Make sense of that? And my job really was to drive cultural change and also to drive more diversity in the management of the organisation. Then 2 decades later, Carnival's new African-American global CEO, Arnold Donald, famously looked out into the carnival world and said, "Where is the diversity?" A sea of white men and me. Very quickly, 3 women were running global brands. African Americans had joined Carnival's Global Leaders Group, and the first African American brand CEO followed. So strong leadership and sound policies are one thing, but entrenched practices are quite another. And I remember early in my time in banking, new policies were cemented, smart young women were joining the bank, and everything seemed to be changing. Meanwhile, in the dealing room, women were confronted by a boozy boys' culture when they were given toys for Christmas, sex toys. Supposedly this was a joke, but actually it was about humiliation. And the behaviour of men in the dealing room was a metaphor for all that was wrong with corporate culture at that time. We think that's extreme and that those days have gone. But sometimes we have to realise they haven't gone everywhere, and we have to be vigilant. As the former Chief of Army David Morrison famously said, you set culture by the things you ignore or walk past as much as by what you do. So that brings me to Hollywood, topic du jour. The exposure of Harvey Weinstein's alleged assaults on women, I say alleged for all your lawyers in the room, alleged assaults, I didn't originally, I put it in for you, unleashed an avalanche of protest against sexism, harassment and rape. Millions of women have told their stories on social media, and millions more have been backing them. The #MeToo hashtag has created a platform that only a year or 2 ago we would not have conceived as possible. The preparedness to speak out against something that has been unspoken for so long is astounding, courageous and difficult. But this was an issue that very few people said anything about and very few people did anything about. Social media has changed that. It's changed everything because it's a communications channel that democratises information. Everyone can speak and be heard without the filter of a journalist or editor deciding whether it's a good story. Individuals tell their own stories. And the rise of Me Too poses a new, though familiar, set of questions for us all. as women leaders and change makers. What does it mean for our leadership? How do we approach the problem? How do we deal with the damage caused? Seeing the world differently means looking under the rock and not being scared of what you find. Today, organisations can't just say we have good policies in place. We have mechanisms to deal with harassment and sexism. Everything is okay. If you don't get complaints, I'd say to you, maybe your mechanisms aren't right, and maybe you're not listening. Now let's get out of that maelstrom and travel to a new front line where change is happening. I'm chairing, as you heard earlier, the Male Champions of Change group in science, technology, engineering and maths, STEM. A group of men who lead large companies that employ people with STEM skills, ranging from technology, engineering and pharma businesses to hospitals and research bodies. The change strategy is disruptive, with these CEOs and executives working collectively with women to disrupt the status quo. And disruption is necessary because the problems are so intractable and we have to accelerate change in STEM. One of our first exercises was for the champions to listen to women in their organisations. We held several focus groups with young women, older women, women of different levels of seniority and backgrounds. And I think it's fair to say that the men were shocked. They hadn't understood how hard the journey had been for the women who'd become successful, who'd made it through. No inkling of what women have had to put up with to be successful, and that hadn't been their own experience as men. The younger women spoke of everyday sexism, the banter. They were very aware of and vocal about such things as being shut down during meetings, locked out of opportunities, the chance for advancement, the mentoring. Our STEM champions have had to confront the facts. Many of the young women they'd been expecting to be their future had zero commitment to the organisation because of the way they were being treated. The women were very clear that things had to change, and it was a big oh shit moment for all. From this listening and learning, change is happening. Some of the organisations are introducing blind shortlisting to their recruitment processes. By removing the name and gender from job applications, the ratio of men to women being shortlisted has jumped from 1 woman in 10 to 50-50. The numbers gave evidence of what we've always been aware of, the bias at work, conscious or unconscious. I actually don't care whether it's unconscious or conscious, it's bias. When hiring, creating a cycle of men recruiting men who look like them. Another example of change is one that's happened in another line of business, in an area sacred to Australians, sport. For those of you on your phones watching the Hawthorn-Richmond game. Caught, all of you. As a board member of Rugby Australia, I, like all Australians, was incredibly proud of the women's rugby sevens when they won gold at the Rio Olympics. And of course, there was a huge upswing in the number of women playing rugby as a result. But many have subsequently expressed surprise at the corresponding rise in the popularity of women's sport more generally. How could this happen? Why? It's not that Australian women don't play sport or aren't competitive. We've had great women, basketballers, netballers, tennis players, squash players, and great women Olympians who, by the way, have long outperformed men. The answer to why there were no women's rugby or AFL teams was that there were no competitions. Women were locked out of the sporting codes that have been the preserve of men. The AFL hierarchy and sports media weren't sure about the AFL women's competition. But of course, the first game, thousands lined up outside a stadium to get in and see women play AFL. To select the Rugby Sevens team for Rio was an example of change waiting to happen. The time was right. We put out a call to women from all sports and invited them to come and try out. And they came from everywhere. Hockey players from the Hockey Roos, runners, sprinters like Elia Green, Suddenly we had this incredible group of women whose individual talents were amazing, but combined, even more amazing. It showed how much pent-up demand there was for participation, and we now have female sporting heroes across all of the football codes. I read a story recently in the Courier Mail about leading Sevens player Charlotte Caslick. It said she had great star power, greater star power than many Wallabies, and declaring she was a perpetually upbeat symbol for rugby. The story called on Rugby Australia to create more of Caslick's star power, noting she had greater social media reach than leading players in the Wallabies and the Broncos combined. This, by the way, was the same Courier Mail where I had found girls' jobs so many years before. So this is change. And change matters. I don't need to tell you the world around us is changing, and not all for the better. We must have the courage to stand up when others hide, to speak when others are silent. Australia, I believe, is a place of opportunity and plenty, and I have had amazing opportunities, but we have so much more potential than is realised in general. We all need to be change makers to achieve gender equality in Australia, to achieve cultural diversity, Indigenous recognition and inclusion. And it's time we all stood up and spoke out on all of those issues. There are so many more examples of change than the ones I've spoken about tonight, where seeing a problem has led to a fundamental change. We're in extraordinary times, the age of social media, the democratisation of information, digital disruption of business globally, and amidst that, the fundamental need to build trust with customers and communities. We have sat by and watched the government of the day self-destruct in the last week, and we've heard politicians from both sides describe behaviour in our parliaments we all know is unacceptable. So we should not be complacent, as there are still so many challenges ahead. So what can I do about it, is the question we should all be asking. If trust is to be regained, we as business and community leaders need to have the courage to speak up, to stand with our communities and be more ambitious for our collective futures and opportunity. We need to see beyond what has always been and imagine what is possible instead, in business, in our parliaments, in our civil institutions. Gender equality, fairness, and diversity are our way forward. They matter, and we all need to speak up to say they matter. Thank you.